Well, as we seek the Lord's help, can we turn back in our Bibles and to the passage that we read together in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes and chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. I'm going to look again at we're going to look at the whole chapter, but we can read verse 10 again. Verse 10 on page 669. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 10. Solomon speaking, he says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. I refused my heart no pleasure. Some of you might like doing jigsaws. Maybe you got one at Christmas. Maybe you're still struggling with it. I don't know if you've ever tried one of these was-gidge puzzles, a back-to-front jigsaw. So you get the picture on the box, but the contents in the box is actually a mirror image of the picture. And it's really challenging as you're trying to put all these pieces together. You've got to keep reminding yourself that this is back to front. And sometimes life can feel like that. As you try and piece together all that is happening, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the picture you had of how life would turn out. And here in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, the writer, he's looking for a purpose to life. He's been wrestling with that age-old question of what's the point? And if you were here last week as we looked at chapter 1, well, he drew a blank. He drew a blank. As he studied nature and then he studied life, he found that it was monotonous, it was meaningless, it was miserable. And he even suggested that God had made it that way. In fact, by the end of chapter 1, he seemed resigned to the fact that you never will find a purpose to life if you leave God out of the equation. However, it would appear as we come into chapter 2 that he's not yet ready to give up his search. And while his skepticism in many ways seems to match the mood of our day, so too does his determination. He's admitting failure just won't do. So chapter 2, he's going to step up his efforts to find meaning, to find satisfaction. He's going to branch out a bit. So at the end of chapter 1, he has experimented with education, with knowledge, with learning. Now he's going to sample enjoyment and then employment. These two, and see if they'll do it for him, if they'll tick all his boxes. And it's almost as if, as we go into chapter 2, he's decided that he's been taking life too seriously. And so he's saying, well, let the fun and games commence. So we're going to see three things from chapter 2 today. First of all, the pursuit of pleasures. Then secondly, the pursuit of possessions. And then thirdly, the pursuit of peace. So these three things he's in search of. Pleasures, possessions, and peace. Before that, though, I want to just give a little bit of information about the author, because I think it might help us. I think it's important, actually, to know it. Last week we concluded that the writer is Solomon. He's not named, although he's named clearly in the Song of Solomon and in the book of Proverbs as a writer. He's not named here. But verse 1 of chapter 1 says, these are the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. And we saw that fits perfectly with Solomon. And in chapter 1, we saw him speaking of his unrivaled wisdom, which again matches Solomon. In chapter 2, we're going to see him speaking about his unequaled wealth, which again would suggest Solomon. And as you go through the book, you'll find lots of different references that reinforce that. In fact, in the very last chapter, in chapter 12, we read that he set in order many proverbs. And of course, he's the guy who gave us the book of Proverbs. So, I don't think there should be any doubt Solomon wrote this. But as you read it, you might be thinking, what kind of guy was Solomon? Was he a good guy or a bad guy? Was Solomon a believer? Or was he an unbeliever? Well, Solomon was actually a believer who went astray. A believer who backslid. The reason God gave him all this great wisdom and great wealth was because he followed the Lord. We're told that he followed in the ways of his father David. But later in his life he went off the rails. And his backsliding began when he had great peace. During David's day, David was always at war. But God gave Solomon great peace. But rather than rely on God to continue that, he thought, I'm going to do something about this myself. I'm going to make some alliances with surrounding nations who were all heathen. And that'll protect my peace. And very often a condition of these alliances was that you took a daughter of the king, the foreign king, the pagan king, and you married them. So Solomon married numerous heathen wives. And to keep them happy, they took their gods with them. He built temples for their idols. And 1 Kings 11 says this, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods. He went off the rails. The book of Ecclesiastes is written very late in his life. And so it's written when he has tried all the pleasures that this world has to offer. He's experienced everything that money can buy. And so in studying this book, we're looking at the mature reflections of a man who knew God, but who thought that maybe there's more satisfaction somewhere else out there. So it's good to bear that in mind as we study this book. So we're going to look first of all then at the pursuit of pleasure. Beginning of chapter 2, Solomon is effectively saying, let's get the party started. Come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. And almost immediately he tells us the party fell flat. The end of verse 1. But that also proved to be meaningless. We saw this last week. He gives us his conclusion immediately. And then he goes on to tell us how he arrived at that conclusion. So he's going to tell us everything he tried. The first thing he tried, beginning of verse 2, was laughter. They got the banter going. Shared a few jokes. Recounted some funny stories. Solomon had maybe heard the saying that laughter is good medicine. For all we know, this guy who came up with all these proverbs, he might have coined the phrase. And you and I know that having a laugh can be good. It maybe alleviates some symptoms, but it's never going to be a cure for a dissatisfied life. In fact, many of the best known comedians are the saddest people you could ever meet. Think, for instance, of Robin Williams. Robin Williams made so many people laugh, but he himself spent more time crying. And you know, I'm sure, that he took his own life in summer 2014. And his story is repeated over and over and over again. Many of the world's great entertainers, although they have massive popularity, they have huge success, they have vast wealth, they're empty and dissatisfied. Elvis Presley had been brought up in the church, and he said to his pastor, when he was at the height of his fame and popularity, he said this. He said, I must be the most miserable young man you've ever met. The most miserable young man you've ever met. And despite the fact that he had millions of fans who loved him, he died alone. Solomon found as well that comedy, laughter, entertainment, it didn't change anything. He says, laughter, I said, is foolish. And so then he's going to try wine and then women. So the wine first in verse 3, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. Well, the two often go together, wine and folly. Solomon may have been the life and soul of the party. But that's only temporary. That's just a temporary escape from reality. And again, it didn't solve his dilemma. Not the wisecracks, not the wine could satisfy. So he's going to try women. And we go down, I'm jumping a wee bit to verse 9, middle of verse 9, we'll go back. But in the middle of verse 9 he says, I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. The Hebrew word that's translated there as harem or harem if you prefer. It's a vague word. Most Bible's translated as concubines. I think the Authorized Version actually leaves it out completely. But certainly if it is a harem, if he's got all these women on call whenever he wants, that ties in with what we know about his life from the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. He had numerous wives and numerous mistresses. Nothing was off limits for this man. Nothing. He tells us that himself. We read it at the start, verse 10. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Solomon did anything he wanted as he sought to find that elusive satisfaction. As he sought an escape from the monotony and the misery of life that he spoke about in chapter 1. And he had the ability to do that. You know, we should actually be thankful that we don't have the ability or the capacity to go to such extremes. Money was no problem for Solomon. We will have things that curtail how far we can go. And be thankful for that. Because Solomon did everything. Did anything he wanted. And you know what he concluded at the end? It was a waste of time and effort. Look at verse 11. He says, yet when I surveyed all my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Nothing. I wonder if you're being tempted today to do something that you know you ought not to. Maybe young folk in particular, but certainly not confined to you. Temptation is not confined to young people alone. Maybe Satan's whispering in your ear. You know, sometimes it's as if Satan's sat-nav whispers in your ear. Go down this route. Try this. It's a scenic route. And you know, there are many scenic detours that you can take in life. But it's not the route that is important. It's the destination. It's where will that take you? Where will it end? A few years ago, a foreign lorry driver in Harris took a wrong turn. That's not good. He realized pretty quick that the road he was on was not suitable for an Arctic truck. He thought, I'll carry on till I find a place to turn. Well, there was no place to turn. It was a dead end. And you know, it was a painful and slow process to get him back out of there. He needed an awful lot of help to go back and reverse up a single track windy road with an Arctic truck. And you know, sometimes it can be well nigh impossible to come back from some of the dead-end routes that we take in life. And some people don't come back. Some don't. By the time I was in my late 20s, 5 of my primary school pals were gone. 5 boys I played football with and began to experiment with were gone before I reached 30. Now we need to listen to Solomon and his wisdom here when he tells us it's a dead end. He tells us it's pointless. He tells us everything he tried amounted to nothing. It's a chasing after the wind. He says you can't hold on to it. It'll just slip through your fingers. You know, living in this way, it's like having a first-class ticket on the Titanic. It's all luxury until you're going down. And the Bible says this. It says there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end, it leads to death. So that's the first thing today, the pursuit of pleasures. I want to move on and look at the pursuit of possessions. Because wine and women didn't satisfy him, he thought he would then experiment with work and wealth. If you're old enough, you might remember The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And in that book, I think it was on radio as well, but there's a powerful supercomputer that's called Deep Thought. And Deep Thought is challenged with coming up with the meaning of life. And it takes a long time working it out, 7 million years. And then Deep Thought makes an announcement. The meaning of life is 42. And a voice comes back and says, 42? Is that all you've got to offer after 7 million years of calculation? And Deep Thought says this, I believe the problem to be, you've never actually known what the question is. And that's true in life. There are people searching for something and they don't know what. They just know there's something missing. They just know that there's something more to life, and they will try anything and everything to fill that void. And just like Solomon, many of them pour themselves into their work. That's what he does here, verses 4 and onwards. At verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves and flourishing trees. I brought male and female slaves and had other slaves born in my house. I owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem. I amassed silver and gold for myself. These verses actually understate the scale of the work that Solomon did. His palace, he took 14 years building it. He didn't just build other houses. He built whole towns. He built a string of towns. 2 Chronicles chapter 8 tell us about all his building exploits. He was a large-scale developer with a massive workforce and a huge amount of livestock. He says himself, more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. That's true. I mean, the Bible tells us how much food it took to feed his workforce. 1 Kings chapter 3. This is what was required for Solomon's staff on a day, for one day. 30 cows, 100 sheep, some venison, chicken, grain, and accompaniments. One day, 30 cows, 10 sheep. You think that's ridiculous? That would feed tens of thousands of people. Yeah? Carry on to the next chapter, 1 Kings chapter 4. It tells us what his workforce was. 150,000 tradesmen and 30,000 labourers. Work for 1 month on, 2 off. Quite like its conditions. But anyway, that's for another day. 180,000, of which a third were working at any time. 60,000 people Solomon would have working for him at any one time. It was construction on a massive scale. It's underplayed here. That was his work. And then his wealth was to match that. He says himself, he amassed silver and gold. Well, he certainly did that. 1 Kings 10 tells us that in any year, in tribute from other nations, this is not even including his own, he received 23 tons of gold. So at today's rate, that's not far off £1 billion worth every year. So we could easily say of Solomon, he had it all. He had it all. Do you know what Solomon says? I had nothing. I had nothing. Verse 11 again. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. He tried wisdom, wine, women, work, wealth. And at the end he wept because nothing worked. Nothing worked. Thomas Edison is probably best known for inventing the light bulb, but he invented numerous other things as well. In fact, he was constantly experimenting. And the vast majorities of them didn't work. And a colleague once said to Edison, What a waste of time. And he said, it's not a waste of time. He says, I now know 10,000 things that don't work. You know, Solomon could say the same. I've tried everything, and nothing works. Now, let's not overlook the fact that it was fun at the time. Of course it is. Solomon says that, middle of verse 10. My heart took delight in all my work. We get satisfaction from what we make. We get satisfaction from what we build. We get satisfaction from what we accumulate. But it's short-lived. Because go on to verse 18 and 19. And see what he says at the end of it all. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to one who comes after me. And who knows whether he'll be a wise man or a fool. Yet he'll have control over all the work into which I poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. You can't take it with you. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. He left it to his son, Rehoboam. And it said that Rehoboam was as foolish as Solomon was wise. And virtually upon taking on the kingdom, he lost 80% of it to a rival king. Exactly what Solomon feared was what happened. You cannot take it with you. I've recounted before the story of a friend who was an alcoholic. Many close shaves with death. He told me that he woke up twice in the safety net that was under the gangway to get onto his ship. But he managed to stop drinking, turned his life around, built himself a house within 5 years of stopping drinking, and he was proud of that. And he invited his neighbour in to see the house, and his neighbour took a tour around the house. He said to him, it's all good, but you won't take it with you. And these few words were what God used to begin a work in this man's life. He realized he wouldn't take it with him. He sought the Lord, and he found the Lord, and he became a minister of the Free Church of Scotland. All because somebody reminded him of an age-old lesson that Solomon learnt 3,000 years ago. You can't take it with you. The pursuit of possessions, then secondly. Just like the pursuit of pleasures that we saw before it. It's meaningless. It will drive you to despair. But then I want to look thirdly at the pursuit of peace, because Solomon is tearing his hair out. Verse 20, he tells us that my heart began to despair. Have you reached that point yet? He tells us in verse 23 that he couldn't sleep at night, with the realization that all his effort was a complete and utter waste of time. It was futile, he says. You know that Professor Richard Dawkins, the atheist, came to the same conclusion about the futility of our experience. Dawkins says in his book, River Out of Eden, he says, human existence is neither good nor evil, neither kind nor cruel, but simply callous, indifferent to all suffering, and lacking all purpose. Our lives are pointless, said Dawkins. And Solomon was pretty much at the same point, but Solomon wasn't an atheist. Solomon had just strayed from God. And now he comes to realize that that's actually what's wrong with his life. That he's sidelined God. And look at what he says in verse 25. Verse 24, he speaks about God. And in verse 25 he says, for without God, who can eat or find enjoyment? He's saying if you rule out God, if you turn your back on God, you're never going to find meaning or satisfaction to life. It's God that gives us purpose. Verse 26, to the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. Who is the man who pleases God? How can you please God? Well, the Bible says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. So that's where you start. You start with faith. You believe and you trust in this God. Otherwise, life is meaningless. But with God, there's a purpose. It might not mean that you'll understand everything. It won't mean that you'll make sense of everything. But you'll know that there's a purpose. The commentator Phil Ryken, he says of Solomon's conclusion at this point, he says it's an oasis of optimism in the midst of a desert of despair. An oasis of optimism in a desert of despair. Solomon, he's tried everything and he's satisfied with nothing. He's investigated everything and he finds nothing new. He accumulated everything and he says, I possessed nothing. He experimented with everything and he achieved nothing. And then he comes to this realization that if you leave God out of the picture, it'll never make sense. You'll never be content. 19th century philosopher Bertrand Russell, he was brought up in the church, but he turned his back on God and he became an atheist. And after he died, his daughter, Lady Catherine Tate, said this. She says, in Dad's heart there was an empty space. That had once been filled by God. And he never found anything else to replace him. If God's not in your heart, nothing else will satisfy. Nothing at all. Solomon realized that nothing could replace God. Without him, he says, who can eat or find enjoyment? As we finish this morning, let's go back to where we started, with the jigsaw. And if you're struggling to piece together everything that's going on in your life or everything that's going on in the world, and if it doesn't make sense, you need God to help you make sense of it. Now, Solomon is not saying, he's not saying that if you trust God, it'll all make sense. Some of it might not make any sense this side of eternity. But what Solomon is saying is, if you have God, then life, he says, life is a gift to be enjoyed, not a puzzle to be solved. A gift to be enjoyed, not a puzzle to be solved. Don't kill yourself trying to work it out. Just trust that God has got this and leave everything with him. May we realize today that there is no lasting enjoyment unless we put our trust in him. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you today that although the life is a puzzle and we can get twisted in knots trying to work it out, Lord, as long as we know that you've worked it out, you see the big picture. We see a jumbled version of it. So help us, Lord, to simply commit ourselves to you, to hand our lives over to you, and trust, Lord, that with you things will eventually make sense. Bless each one of us, we pray, as you see our need. We ask this in Jesus. Amen. We're going to finish singing in Psalm 89 on page 118. Page 118, Psalm 89, at verse 28. I'm going to sing from 28 down to 36. The tune is Lord of the Years. Lord of the Years. And in these verses, it is God speaking to David, so that's to Solomon's father David, and promising him that even though his sons may go astray, that they will come back, and that the Lord will never take his love from David's offspring. Psalm 89 at verse 28. I will maintain my love to him forever. My covenant with him will never fail. His line forevermore I will establish. While heaven lasts, his kingdom will prevail. Verses 28 to 36, the tune is Lord of the Years. Will stand to sing.
I will maintain my love to him forever. My covenant with him will never fail. His line forevermore I will establish. His kingdom will prevail. But if his sons forsake my laws and statutes, and violate my covenant command, I am punished with the rod of their transgression, their sin with blows inflicted by my hand. But I will never take my love from David, my faithfulness I never will betray, nor will I ever violate my covenant or alter what I said.